We've kind of seen a boomerang in consumer spending from shutdowns in the pandemic, and then stimulus checks put money back in people's pockets and people were going out and spending. Well, all of that savings that got built up over that period has now started to be depleted.
Lately, it seems to be all the buzz on social media, the financial news, and even discussions at my kids' soccer practices. Are we in a recession or not? Big questions like this are always better with really smart friends, so I thought I'd invite my friend Meghan Rabuse on the show again today. Meghan, also known as the Family Finance Mom, is the host of the popular Finance Explained podcast. Meghan is a former financial analyst, a mom of 3, and quickly becoming one of my favorite repeat guests. Welcome back to the show, Meghan.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy.
Good to see you again, and I love tackling these big questions that everybody is trying to answer themselves with you. So, Meghan, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought the traditional definition of a recession was 2 consecutive quarters of negative gross domestic product. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong, Andy. Any of us who took a high school economics course, we were taught that is still historically, indicative of a recession. And I think that it's not just a historical thing. I mean, generally speaking, a recession is a slowdown or a decrease from one period to the next in economic activity. And we measure economic activity with GDP. So if you have 2 quarters in a row of negative or declining GDP, that would be consistent with what we think of as a recession, which is a slowdown in economic activity. So where did all this kind of, are we not? We had 2 negative quarters of GDP growth, but people are saying we might not be in a recession. Where is that all coming from? Not to get super political, but some of it is, I think, political spin. We had the White House administration and many of the other parties, like the Treasury Secretary, kind of come out and say, well, the definition of recession is more involved than that. To be super specific, there is an agency in the United States known as the National Bureau of Economic Research. You can check them out at nber.org. They are the official economic cycle dating organization in the US. So they are the ones who review all the economic data that is out there, and they'll come out and say, hey, peak economic activity was this date. We are officially in a recession. And then they will come out at some point in the future and also say the opposite, that the trough was hit and now the economy is in recovery. So basically you have people pointing and saying, well, hey, NBER hasn't declared it yet. What I will tell you is that NBER typically takes anywhere from 4 to 12 months after a recession has begun to officially declare it. So that is kind of, from my personal kind of informed, educated opinion, both from, having a degree in finance and business economics, having lived through a few cycles as a financial professional, everything that I see out there right now would lead me to believe that we are currently in a recession.
It makes sense. It makes sense a lot, and math doesn't lie, right? I mean, it's their numbers, right, and they say what the truth is. And now I think that maybe there's folks out there, and even me, maybe it doesn't feel like a recession yet. It doesn't feel as bad as the recessions that maybe you and I have been through in the past. Is it different right now than some recessions we've seen in the past?
Sure. So I guess a couple of things, to kind of reinforce why I feel like we likely already are. There's a handful of things that from all intensive purposes, if you look historically, when these things happen, we are in a recession. And then there's one big thing that is why many people are saying, well, maybe not quite yet. So the 3 big things in my mind that tell us we are definitely in a recession right now. One, I already talked about, we've actually now had reported 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, which, as you started this episode, that historically has been the traditional definition of a recession. So that's one. The second thing is the stock market is in a bear market. It's down over 20% and has been now for a couple weeks. Historically speaking, that is generally a good indication of a recessionary environment. Now, every time the stock market has a 20% decline, we haven't always been ended up having a recession. However, every recession has had almost a 20% stock market decline or pretty close to it. So, it's sort of one of those all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares situations. But generally speaking, the stock market is a leading indicator for the real economy. So what do I mean by that? Typically, the stock market is going to have its bottom about 6 to 12 months before the real economy, or what GDP says the economy is doing. So that's kind of the other indicator that if we're not in one, we may be in one soon. And then the third thing that I've been paying close attention to is consumer spending data, because, and I think we've talked about this here before, our US economy is heavily consumer driven. So what you and I, that's when I say consumers, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about all the people listening out there, what we go out and spend. So what we're spending on groceries, what we're spending on, clothes for our kids, what we're spending to put gas in our cars, what we're spending to, buy replacement goods. If you need a new car, all of those things add up to consumer spending. And what we've kind of seen a boomerang in consumer spending from shutdowns in the pandemic, and then stimulus checks put money back in people's pockets and people were going out and spending. Well, all of that savings that got built up over that period has now started to be depleted. Savings rates are back to near record low levels, and consumer spending on a real basis, so if we strip out the impact of inflation, is basically just barely positive. And real incomes, so what you and I are bringing in as disposable income every month that helps fuel that spending, has been negative now for several months. And so that is a mismatch that is not sustainable, right? Like, we can't continue to outspend or spend more than we're bringing in on a consistent basis. So at some point, something's got to give, right? And if we as consumers, and I think this is something that's really important because you brought up, maybe you don't feel like you're in a recession. The way that we as consumers feel about the economy is just as important as the data itself. And why is that? Well, going back to consumer spending makes up 2/3 of the economy. If you don't feel good about where the economy is headed, if you're worried about your job or a potential job loss, if you're worried that your income, next month may not be what it was this month, how is that going to impact your spending behavior? And if you pull back on spending, that pulls back on the economy as a whole, and it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I mean, that is how I'm feeling lately based on all the news and all the conversations. I feel like I am paying attention to my emergency fund, my long-term money in the bank a lot more than I have in the past. Now, let's talk about, we're in a recession. We're maybe going to get into a worse one. What are some smart financial moves that people can make during a recession?
So one of the things that I tell people first and foremost is start, even if you feel good about your job, it can always be helpful to have what I call a bare bones budget prepared. Even if you don't put it in place, it's basically giving yourself an action plan when and if the worst happens, when and if your company institutes layoffs and you're on that list. You can go home and immediately, these are the bills I'm going to eliminate. These are the action steps I'm going to take in order to make whatever savings I have last for as long as possible until, I can collect on unemployment, until I can find a new job. And so that is something you can do right now. And the other thing is you can implement it if you want in order to kind of ratchet up your savings, beef up your emergency fund. And the question I always get after this one is, well, how much should my emergency fund be? What I tend to tell people, especially heading into this uncertain economic environment, is make sure you understand the industry that you work in. Is it highly cyclical? Meaning, is it very much impacted by the ups and downs of the economy? Do you work in an industry where they are quick to cut jobs in an economic downturn? If that's the case, you want to err on the higher end of this range. And I tend to tell people kind of 3 to 6 months of living expenses. So once you've made that bare bones budget, what does that monthly expense number look like for you? Multiply that by 3 to 6, and that's kind of what your emergency fund target should be. And if you work in an environment where your job is potentially more at risk, you would definitely want to err towards the 6-month side more so than the 3-month side. But that, I think, is the most important thing that anybody can do, because the reality is that recessions are a very real part of the economic cycle. The good news is they're also the most short-lived part of the economic cycle historically. And if we look back, over 100 plus years, the economy has recovered from every recession and gone on to, reach new heights. So it's really just setting yourself up to be able to weather this short-term period of contraction until the economy recovers again.
Yeah, I think you've used the word in the past, natural, as a way to describe recessions. This is just something that happens, and it's going to go away eventually, but it is good to prepare for it. It's almost like a storm. Storms don't last forever, but you got to prepare for the storm, right? So let's talk about stock market investing. Obviously, you talked about this abysmal market we've been dealing with all year. What is it? Negative 24%, down 24%. Let's talk about what smart moves somebody could make as an investor during a recession.
Yeah. One of the things that I keep getting asked too is is this going to be a lost decade? That's, I feel like, a term that keeps being bantered about right now. And here's what I will say is that when you look at the stock market performance over a long period of time, it's sort of, I use this phrase a lot in a lot of contexts, but when in doubt, zoom out, right? So if you look at year-to-date stock market performance, the market basically peaked right at the end of 2021, and we've been in a drawdown for all of 2022. Well, if you zoom out, right, go back to 2008 when the market was at its worst, and we're up I don't know off the top of my head, some insane amount since that period of time. And so I kind of look at this as creating buying opportunities, right? And remember how I said that the stock market is a leading indicator of the real economy? By the time the NBER comes out and says, oh, we're officially in a recession, and we're now in, the recovery phase, the market is likely already recovering. Just like it is going to be down before the real economy is down, it's going to be recovering before the real economy recovers. So what I tell people over and over and over again is invest consistently and for the long term. These ups and downs along the way, the month-to-month movements, even the year-to-year movements, they're part of that long-run average return expectation that is 9% a year. So that includes these years that are down 20+%. It also includes the years that are up 40%. And so, whenever you're thinking about investing, it should be for kind of long-term goals so that you can realize those long-term averages. And when you see markets like now, this is when returns are made. And, you may not realize them until the market recovers, but really sophisticated investors who have, really long-term strong performance histories, this is when they make their money, by buying in these down markets.
So if you have that 3 to 6 months set aside, you've got that bare bones budget ready just in case things go wrong, and you've been dollar cost averaging. If you've got extra money, this is an opportunity. Is that right?
Absolutely. And one thing I would just say is the 3 to 6 months emergency fund, you should not be investing that. Because that's cash that you want readily accessible. Money that you're investing should be money, that you don't need in the next couple of years, that you can allow it to be in the market and be at work. And like I said, realize those long-term returns.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Meghan, this is an important conversation to have. I think there's a lot of people talking about how great investing is and all the great stuff, especially in really big years where the stock market's up. I think it's important to have voices in conversations like this to let people know that this is a natural progression in the market, and this too shall pass, and keep your steady Eddie smart moves when it comes to investing, as well as protecting your families with a good emergency fund and a budget. So what's new in the family finance mom world, Meghan? Tell us what's going on.
Sure. So I also have my own podcast, Finance Explained. Actually, the very first episode of season 3 was this very question: are we in a recession? And if you want to kind of hear more of like the data-driven points of what says we are, what says we're not, and what I'm looking at and tracking as kind of we continue to move into 2022 and 2023, you can check that out. Basically, every week I cover the top 3 financial headlines of the week and then give a deep dive on some specific personal finance topic. Like last week was all about wills and trusts. So you can catch me there if you guys are podcast fans.
Meghan, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.